Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Imagine stepping off a noisy, hypermodern New York City street, taking one step, and instantly crossing into a 250-year-old bubble.
Yeah, it's wild.
It really is. You're suddenly immersed in this world where the internet is strictly filtered through physical cubicles, the spoken language is a relic of pre-Holocaust Europe, and every single action from, the specific garments you wear to the exact mechanical way you brush your teeth is dictated by this intense, all-consuming devotion to God.
Right, it touches literally every aspect of life.
Exactly. And if you like my channel, please subscribe and hit the like button, because today we are taking you right up to the edge of that invisible boundary in Brooklyn, and then we're stepping across to figure out how it actually survives.
So we're basing this exploration on a really fascinating first-hand documentary account by the traveler Drew Binsky.
Yeah, he got incredible access.
He really did.
Yeah.
I mean, he managed to get inside America's most closed-off religious community, the Hasidic Jews of New York. And, the goal for this deep dive is to understand the physical and mental boundaries they've constructed.
It's not just about the rules, right?
No, exactly. We aren't just looking at the strict rules they live by. We're really trying to unpack the deep theological why behind them, like why build this impenetrable fortress of faith right in the middle of the 21st century.
Yeah, and to really grasp the sheer scale of this isolation, we have to establish that this is not how all Jewish communities in New York operate.
Right, not at all.
The source material actually notes that Hasidic Jews make up only about 5% of the total Jewish population.
Which is a tiny fraction when you think about it.
It is. And Binsky actually starts his journey up in Washington Heights in Manhattan, hanging out with teenagers from the modern Orthodox community who study at Yeshiva University.
And the contrast there is essential for setting the baseline for our deep dive today.
Yeah, how so?
Well, the modern Orthodox community is, deeply devoted to God and Scripture, but they actively incorporate modern inventions, technology, and secular higher education right into their religious lives.
Oh, right. Like in Washington Heights, you see that bustling Israeli grill. You hear people seamlessly blending French, Hebrew, and English.
Exactly. You see teenagers using smartphones to text their friends. Their relationship with God is integrated directly into the fabric of the modern secular world.
But then you hop in a cab, ride down to South Williamsburg in Brooklyn, and boom, that integration just vanishes completely.
It's like it never existed.
The literal border between these worlds is a single street. Broadway.
Just one street.
Yeah. You have the subway screeching right above your head, secular New Yorkers rushing past with coffee cups, and the moment you cross the street, the entire environment shifts.
The clothing changes to entirely traditional garments. The street signs shift to Yiddish.
The atmosphere completely transforms. But, okay, let's unpack this. Because
Right.
here's what I am struggling to wrap my head around. A physical street is not a wall.
No, it's just asphalt.
Right. It's like stepping through a sci-fi portal or a time machine. How does a community actually enforce a boundary in the middle of the most interconnected, chaotic city on the planet? I mean, people can just walk away.
Well, yeah, they could.
Teenagers can just cross the street and buy a smartphone if they want to.
They could physically walk away, sure. But what's fascinating here is that the physical border of Broadway is really just a symptom of a massive mental and spiritual barricade.
A spiritual barricade.
Right. This insularity, it's a highly calculated ecosystem designed entirely to protect their relationship with God.
Protect it from what, exactly?
From the secular world, from the Hasidic perspective, the outside world isn't just, different. It is saturated with distractions, vanities, and temptations that could corrupt a pure, unadulterated connection to the divine.
Wow. So it's seen as an actual threat.
Oh, absolutely. If you believe that your soul's primary purpose is to serve and honor God, then allowing secular influence into your daily life is an existential threat. So they draw a hard line in the concrete because they have already drawn a hard line in their minds.
I mean, that deep theological defense mechanism makes sense on one level, but it creates this massive historical paradox when you look at how this movement actually started.
Oh yeah, the origins are completely different from what you'd expect.
Exactly. It wasn't founded on building walls or shutting out the world. The Hasidic movement was born roughly 250 years ago in Ukraine.
Right, by Israel ben Eliezer.
Yeah, the guy who became known as the Baal Shem Tov.
And his original motivation completely flips the modern perception of the community on its head.
How so?
Well, at the time, he felt that mainstream Judaism had become incredibly dry, academic, and just overly focused on elite textual study.
Like too much in the books, not enough in the heart.
Exactly. He wanted to democratize faith and inject raw, ecstatic passion into it. The entire foundation of Hasidism was the idea of revealing the presence of godliness in the everyday world.
So it was actually about opening things up.
Right. He taught that you didn't have to be a brilliant scholar to connect with God. You could reach the divine through joy, music, fervor, and spontaneous prayer.
Wow. So we have a movement born from a desire for spiritual liberation and spontaneous joy, yet over 2 centuries later, it has crystallized into one of the most rigidly controlled societies on Earth.
It really has.
The documentary captures this tension perfectly through the story of Abby Stein.
Yeah, her story is really intense.
It is. She is a direct descendant of the movement's founder. She was raised inside this very community in Williamsburg, but she eventually left and came out publicly as transgender.
And her return to the neighborhood with the documentary crew, it really reveals the absolute zero-tolerance policy for deviation there.
Yeah, the source explains that when Abby came out to her father, who was a prominent rabbi in the community, his reaction was rooted in strict patriarchal doctrine.
Right.
He told her she was doing a horrible thing, expressing this deeply sexist view that women are worth much less than men, and he severed all contact with her.
And as she walks the streets of Williamsburg during the film, you can see the hostility is just palpable. People stare, they yell, and she even recounts having eggs thrown at her on previous visits.
And Abby says something during that walk that really anchors the reality of this community. She says she will absolutely fight for the right of people to choose this highly structured, devoted way of life if it is truly what they want.
But then she adds that devastating caveat.
Right. She says, most people don't have a choice. The ecosystem just doesn't allow for it.
Yeah.
And just to be completely clear, for you listening, we are simply reporting the facts of the documentary here. We aren't endorsing or condemning the parents' strict adherence to their religious doctrine, nor are we taking a stance on Abby's identity.
Right, we're just looking at the source material.
Exactly. We are looking purely at the friction that occurs when modern individual identity collides with a fundamentalist system.
And that friction is the core of the paradox here. I mean, to understand how a movement shifts from ecstatic spiritual joy to a system where nonconformists are entirely exiled, you really have to look at the trauma of the 20th century.
You mean the Holocaust?
Specifically the Holocaust, yeah. The Hasidic community we see in Brooklyn today is a second and third generation post-Holocaust society.
So they are carrying all that history with them.
Exactly. When the survivors arrived in America, they carried an overriding, almost unbearable obligation to rebuild a world that had just been systematically exterminated.
Wow. So the rigidity isn't just about rules.
No, it's a trauma response. They locked down their traditions, their dress, and their language to prevent cultural extinction.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, giving individuals the choice to leave feels, to them, like finishing the work of the people who tried to wipe them out.
Man. So survival requires absolute control over the environment. They can't live retention up to chance. So they have engineered this parallel universe to ensure leaving is practically impossible.
Right, they built the infrastructure for it.
Let's look at how they construct this isolation, because it touches every single pressure point of human life. First, the language barrier. Yiddish is the spoken language for everything.
The street signs, the magazines, the children's books.
All of it.
And, the linguistic isolation is a brilliant, if extreme, retention strategy.
How so?
Well, before World War II, millions of Jews spoke Yiddish across Eastern Europe. Out of the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis, roughly 5 million of them were Yiddish speakers.
Oh, wow. So it was almost entirely wiped out.
Exactly. It was almost wiped off the map. Today, there are only about 600,000 Yiddish speakers left globally, and a massive concentration of them are right there in Brooklyn.
That's incredible.
By maintaining Yiddish as the absolute primary language of the home and the street, they are doing two things simultaneously. They are honoring the millions who were murdered, but functionally, they are actively shielding their children from the English-speaking secular culture that surrounds them.
Right, because if your foundational language isn't English, engaging with the outside world becomes inherently difficult.
Exactly, it builds a natural wall.
And the family structure reinforces that isolation exponentially. The documentary highlights that marriage happens incredibly young, almost always at 18.
Yeah.
And the birth rates are just staggering. Families with 10 to 15 children are the standard norm.
Yeah, one person in the doc casually mentions having 12 siblings.
12.
Mhm.
And another local jokes that having 20 grandkids by the time you're 40 years old is considered a low number.
Which is just, mind-blowing.
If you just do the basic math on that, it is an absolute demographic explosion. A single patriarch could have hundreds of descendants within his own lifetime.
And a population boom of that magnitude necessitates a completely self-contained physical infrastructure.
You can't rely on standard New York City services for that.
No, you can't. You see it walking down the street. Massive, specialized lines for local pediatricians, endless storefronts selling nothing but strollers.
Yeah, the strollers everywhere.
And then you have the dress code, which acts as a constant visual barrier between them and the rest of the city.
Let's talk about the dress code.
For the men, it's the payes, the long side curls.
Mm-hmm.
This originates from an ancient biblical commandment regarding how to cut the hair on the sides of the head. But it has evolved into a profound cultural symbol.
Right.
It visually separates them from the secular world the moment they step outside.
And the modesty rules for women take that visual separation even further. The source notes that once a woman is married, she dresses highly conservatively, but she also completely shaves her head to a 000.
Yeah, completely bald.
And then she wears a wig whenever she is in public. What is the theological logic behind removing the hair entirely rather than just, covering it?
It is rooted in the extreme interpretation of modesty, or tsinut, in Jewish law. The hair is considered a point of physical beauty and vanity. By completely shaving the head, the woman removes that vanity entirely. The wig then serves to allow her to move through the public sphere without drawing attention. But beneath it, her true natural identity is reserved exclusively for her husband and for God.
Wow. So it is a physical manifestation of prioritizing the spiritual over the physical.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. That brings up the most fascinating modern challenge for them. Technology.
Oh yeah, the internet.
Right. You can control clothing and language, but there is free Wi-Fi practically bleeding through the walls in New York City. How do you stop a teenager from just accessing the secular world digitally?
It's a huge issue for them.
They've instituted these places called cubicles, which are essentially kosher internet cafes. You walk in, pay by the hour, and you get access to a heavily filtered, completely sanitized version of the web.
Yeah, the documentary host actually compares it to the restricted internet in North Korea.
Which sounds extreme.
The North Korea comparison highlights the level of censorship, but the motivation is entirely different. This isn't about political control. It's about spiritual purity.
Right.
The internet is arguably the greatest threat to a community that relies on avoiding secular temptation. So the kosher internet strips away imagery, social media, and any secular content deemed inappropriate by the rabbis.
So it's basically a digital clean room.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. It allows them to conduct necessary business or essential communications without accidentally stumbling upon the vanities of the outside world.
And they don't even rely on the city for emergencies. They have Hatzalah, their own free, highly trusted ambulance service.
Yeah, they don't call 911 at all.
They have a specialized local number memorized. It really paints a picture of a community that views the human body simply as a vessel for the soul. I mean, the kosher internet, the private ambulances, the Yiddish language, it all functions as an elaborate, city-sized defense mechanism for the soul.
A defense mechanism built entirely on mutual dependence. That
Yeah.
is the genius of the ecosystem.
Mutual dependence, yeah.
You don't need the outside world to read the news because you have local Yiddish bookstores that only print approved material.
Right.
You don't need secular city services for a heart attack because you have Hatzalah ambulances driven by people in your own community. You don't need outside supermarkets because you have specialized kosher delis serving traditional Eastern European food like goulash and matzo ball soup.
So they never have to leave.
Never. The entire system is engineered so that from birth to death, a person never actually has to look outside the bubble for their physical needs. That structural isolation ensures they rely only on each other and ultimately on God.
And that absolute reliance on God's law dictates everything, extending all the way to global geopolitics.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
There is a moment in the source material that is genuinely shocking to anyone outside the community. The Satmar sect, which makes up the vast majority of the Hasidic population in South Williamsburg, is extremely anti-Zionist.
Yeah, it is a striking visual when the documentary host is walking the streets of Williamsburg. He points out this glaring omission.
No flags.
Right. In this deeply Orthodox, passionately Jewish neighborhood, there is not a single Israeli flag anywhere.
To a secular outsider, that completely shatters your assumptions.
Totally.
We are largely conditioned to think that devout Judaism and support for the modern state of Israel go hand in hand. It feels like, I don't know, discovering a neighborhood of ultra-traditional Catholics who actively protest the existence of the Vatican.
It's a great analogy.
How can the most Orthodox Jewish community in the country be fundamentally opposed to the Jewish state?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the answer lies in their absolute, unyielding fundamentalism. Their geopolitical worldview is not based on modern politics or nationalism at all.
Okay, what is it based on?
It is based entirely on a strict interpretation of ancient text. The Satmar theology dictates that establishing a Jewish state through human, political, or military intervention before the arrival of the Messiah is a direct violation of Jewish law.
Wait, so they think the state itself is a violation?
Exactly. As one person in the documentary explains, they pray every single day to return to Israel, but they're waiting for a holy one. They believe that only divine power can bring about the true return, not human tanks, missiles, or, United Nations declarations.
That is a massive distinction. Their allegiance isn't to a modern geopolitical nation state. Their allegiance is exclusively to an ancient divine timeline written in the Torah.
Right. Taking matters into their own hands, to them, is an arrogant rejection of God's plan.
And again, just to be perfectly clear to you listening, we are not taking a stance on Zionism or anti-Zionism here.
Right, we're just explaining the theology.
Exactly. We are analyzing how an incredibly strict interpretation of Scripture radically alters a community's view of global politics. They are willing to stand entirely apart from the vast majority of the global Jewish population because their reading of God's law demands it.
It proves that their devotion is not just some cultural aesthetic. It is a deeply held theological framework that they will not compromise, regardless of how unpopular it makes them. But as restrictive, intense, and heavily scrutinized as all these public rules and political stances are, the documentary also reveals the beautiful, private reward for all this discipline.
The sanctuary of the home.
Yes, the ultimate sanctuary.
After all the talk of harsh exiles, canceled family members, and intense street-level barriers, we finally see what happens when the sun goes down on Friday evening. We see Shabbat.
And the level of peace it brings looks almost incomprehensible to a modern mind.
It really does. Shabbat is a 25-hour period of absolute mandated rest, running from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday.
And when this community says rest, they mean it in the most literal, extreme theological sense possible.
Yeah, you cannot work. You cannot drive. You cannot look at a phone. You cannot cook.
You can't even flip a light switch.
Which is crazy. Why a light switch?
Because completing an electrical circuit is considered a form of creation, and human creation must cease to honor God's creation.
The micromanagement of this rest is staggering. I mean, the documentary details the rules around brushing your teeth.
Oh, the toothbrush.
Yeah. You aren't allowed to squeeze water out of anything on Shabbat because extracting liquid is technically categorized as work under their interpretation of the law.
Right.
So you can't use a regular nylon toothbrush with toothpaste. Instead, someone actually invented a specific Shabbat toothbrush made with widely spaced rubber bristles so water doesn't get trapped and squeezed out. They are regulating human behavior down to a literal drop of water.
I mean, it sounds exhausting to an outsider, but the flip side of that micromanagement is the sheer majesty of the celebration.
Yeah, it's not all just stress about rules.
No, it is a weekly crowning achievement. The documentary shows the men donning the shtreimel as they prepare for the evening.
Oh, the history of the shtreimel is incredible. It is this massive circular fur hat that costs around $5,000.
$5,000
Yeah?
for a hat.
Yeah. And the legend behind it is that hundreds of years ago in Eastern Europe, an anti-Semitic king or count wanted to humiliate the local Jewish population. He decreed that they had to wear animal tails, which were considered the lowest, most disrespectful part of the animal. But instead of accepting the humiliation, the Jewish community took those tails, wove them together, and created these towering, beautiful crowns to honor God.
Wow.
They took an insult designed to degrade them and turn it into royalty.
It is the ultimate symbol of spiritual resilience. Wearing that crown, they sit down to a massive, joyous feast.
Yeah, challah bread, wine, gefilte fish, slow-cooked colon, and large amounts of meat.
And notably, absolutely no dairy is present.
Right, because keeping kosher strictly forbids the mixing of meat and dairy at the same meal.
Exactly.
The documentary host is sitting at this feast, and he is completely disconnected from his cameras. He actually had to hire a non-Jewish operator just to film the dinner respectfully without breaking the community's rules.
Yeah, that was a cool detail.
And he has this profound realization. He says that normally on a Friday night, his boss is texting him, his emails are pinging, he is stressing about the weekend, and his mind is fractured in a dozen places.
Which is how most of us live.
Right. But sitting at that table, there is total peace. So what does this all mean? It functions as a mandatory, divinely enforced weekly digital detox.
A digital detox, exactly.
Imagine the sheer psychological relief of knowing that for 25 solid hours, the rest of the world effectively ceases to exist. No one can reach you. No emergencies exist outside your front door. You cannot solve any problems even if you wanted to.
You're just there.
It is just you, your family, your food, and your faith.
And that is the absolute crux of the Hasidic experience. The rigorous rules of Shabbat, the rubber toothbrushes, the inability to turn on a light switch, the ban on carrying items, they aren't viewed by the people inside the community as a burden.
They don't see it as restrictive.
No. To them, these rules are the ultimate expression of love and faith. By completely severing ties with the mechanics, anxieties, and choices of the modern world, they force themselves to be entirely present.
Present in the moment.
Right. They are present with one another, and they are present with the divine. It is a 25-hour sanctuary built not out of bricks, but out of time itself.
It really makes you evaluate the psychological weight of having endless choices.
It does. I mean, when you synthesize everything we've explored from the sources today, Hasidic Brooklyn reveals a profound dual nature.
Yeah, it's definitely two-sided.
On one hand, it is an undeniably restrictive, closed-off fortress. It actively limits the intellectual and physical choices of its members, filters their information, and, as we saw with the heartbreaking reality of Abby Stein, it can be incredibly harsh and unforgiving to those who do not or cannot fit into its rigid mold.
Absolutely.
But on the exact same street, it is a miraculous, beautiful preservation of a culture that survived the darkest horrors of the 20th century. It's a living, breathing testament to human resilience, communal support, and the sheer power of shared, unyielding belief in God.
And that brings us right back to you listening to this deep dive. Think about the street you live on.
Yeah, think about your daily life.
Think about the phone in your pocket, the endless stream of notifications, the infinite choices of who to be, what to read, and how to live that you have access to every single second of the day.
It's overwhelming.
We live in a hyper-connected, deeply secular world where we celebrate absolute personal freedom above almost everything else. Yet, despite all those infinite choices, so many people today feel incredibly isolated, anxious, and adrift.
Right.
So here's a final thought to take with you as you go about your day. We started by imagining crossing Broadway, leaving the modern world behind for a 250-year-old bubble.
The time machine.
Exactly. If you were offered that trade, if you had to give up your personal freedom, your smartphone, your ability to choose exactly who you want to be, but in exchange, you were guaranteed an unbreakable community that would never let you fall, absolute certainty in your daily purpose, and a direct, uninterrupted line to God.
What is the psychological trade-off of that choice?
Are modern secular freedoms always worth the isolation they sometimes bring?
Something to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.